Our exhibit overviews political cartoons, their evolution throughout history, and how they have impacted American politics and society. We will begin with the first notable feature in our exhibit, which is the info panel and display case of the Join or Die cartoon by Benjamin Franklin. It describes how it was originally created in 1754 to promote colonial unity during the French and Indian War, and would eventually go on to become the primary image of the American Revolution. It became a beacon of unity throughout the American Revolution and throughout the nation's history. Across this first info panel is a create your own cartoon station. It is intuitive and easy to do so that young children can spend their time here while their parents are focused on touring the exhibit. Accompanying the station is a brief recount of the history of the printing press. Moving along the timeline, we skipped ahead to 1861 with the start of the Civil War. The panel describes the causes of the war in depth, including slavery, economic differences, tariffs, states' rights, and election of Lincoln, among other causes. It covers how costly of a war it was, and thus how important keeping public support was. The display case features a cartoon in which Southerners are exaggeratedly portrayed as thieves who are trying to steal from the American people. This became a style in future cartoons. Next, there's an info panel with a detailed overview of Thomas Nast and his impact on the history of political cartoons. It also includes a description of why Thomas Nast is considered the father of political cartoons. We will go over the tweed scandal and how Thomas Nast was able to bring down an entire political machine by publishing his cartoons in the Harper's Weekly. These cartoons are displayed above. We then discuss how this is an example of large political ramifications occurring as a result of political cartoons. Next on the timeline is the Spanish-American War. With this info panel, we will discuss the rise of yellow journalism during the period and the heavily exaggerated cartoons that helped America enter a war. As the room curves, we will transition into the 20th century and have a brief description overviewing how in the first 40 years of the century, the U.S. would be involved in some of the most important conflicts in history and how cartoons would be essential in pushing agendas regarding them. The first event we have on Wall B is the Progressive Era. The info panel contains information and examples of how cartoonists were able to expose the horrors of American society and necessary changes. It highlights how the image of businesses in these cartoons were exaggeratedly and cartoonishly evil in order to draw an emotional reaction from the viewer. Next, we move to the suffrage movement, which talks about how women were fighting for equal treatment after their hard work during World War I. The panel analyzes how cartoonists were able to mimic World War I propaganda on fighting for equal treatment and basic freedoms of self-determination, and apply them to the suffrage movement in order to draw parallels and rally support for their cause. Across from this panel, we can see the famous quote from Thomas Nast that expresses his courageous and defiant spirit, and the quote reads, "Boss Tweed, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it?" Accompanying this quote is a description on the underlying meaning of his quote and the ramifications and possible consequences that came because of it. Next to that is a panel from the cartoonist Herb Bloch, who famously said, "The press must speak out, and if the occasion arises, raise bloody hell." Again, there's a description on the significance of this quote, and a brief description of how influential Herbert Lawrence Bloch, or Herb Bloch, was in creating dissent, especially towards the Vietnam War. We then jump ahead to World War II and the process of rallying support behind the war effort. The panel gives historical context on how difficult of a task cartoonists had to rally the public behind a war taking place overseas. We will talk about specific cartoonists such as Dr. Seuss and how he famously created cartoons that employed racist and often offensive stereotypes to scare people into supporting the war. We then transition into Wall C and the era of the nation post-war. Post-war America was one of economic prosperity, but there were also complex issues that required cartoonists to inform and influence the public. Our first panel of this wall is on the civil rights movement and the Double V campaign. The panel discusses, with historical context, the Jim Crow laws and massive race discrimination in America. It covers how cartoonists employed stark and often horrifying imagery of African American treatment in America to force a feeling of shame, anger, and action among the American people. In the next panel, we discuss the Vietnam War and the cartoonists around it. We will discuss what made the Vietnam War a contentious issue and how cartoonists were able to cause public outrage to force an end to the war. The panel describes how the cartoonist Herblock shaped modern political cartoons as well as specific cartoons he made that are displayed, and also, with those cartoons, a brief description on how they impacted politics at the time. Across from this panel are 3 display cases which show newspapers from different time periods in American history. One is from 1776, one is from 1861, and one is from 1942. Our last stop on the exhibit is a concluding panel which contains an overview of the impact of cartoons on American politics and society, and how cartoons are still alive in today's politics. In a display case, there is a cartoon published which attacks the Trump administration for pulling out of the Iran deal. As viewers leave the exhibit, they will see the quote by Napoleon stating that the cartoonist James Gillray did more than all the armies in Europe to bring him down. We feel that this quote is the perfect ending as it ties in how important political cartoons have been throughout history. We hope that the viewers of the exhibit were able to learn new and interesting information about a lesser known but important aspect of American politics. We also hope that through this exhibit we are able to excite viewers enough so that they are willing to conduct further research on historically significant political cartoons, along with analyzing the political cartoons that they see today in the news or online for both the techniques and message of the cartoonist. Thank you so much for participating in the visual tour of our exhibit. We hope you enjoyed it.